Patrick Wood is one of my favorite historians. He is an extraordinary man who has spent 3 or 4 decades studying technocracy. And what he found, what the elites were planning to do back in the 1930s, 90 years ago in the United States, sounds like science fiction. They wanted to tokenize everything, measure everything, uh, dole out how much energy, how much food, etc. you could have, give everybody the same amount. It was a crazy scheme. Who would have taken it seriously? And yet, it is a version of that that we are facing now with this biodigital convergence and the emergence of a technocratic plan for the entire world. Patrick has written several books. These are important books. They're not big. I have 4 of them. Globalization, Technocracy Rising. This is an important one. Technocracy, The Hard Road to World Order, and The Evil Twins, Technocracy and Transhumanism. I'm going to let Patrick now give you a bit of the history and tell you what the plan is for us. Thank you.
Greetings, I'm Patrick Wood for technocracy.news, that is Technocracy News and Trends. I'm glad to be with you today to talk about the war on food in particular. I've been chronicling this for many years, as you know. That's only one part, however, of the total war being waged against us. And I've been recently talking about this concept of omni-war, that basically is technocracy's asymmetric strategy against the world. This is painfully obvious when you look at the individual components of the war. We see, for instance, the global pandemic, Panic 2020. We see the destruction of free speech everywhere in the world right now. We see global biological attacks. We see global economic destruction. We see a global energy crisis, etc. We see a global financial crisis coming at us like a freight train right now. And we also see the global food crisis. This is a big one for sure, because we all need food to survive. So this is not a small part of this war. However, I just kind of want to focus my attention just on the food crisis right now. And there's basically probably a little bit of good news along the way. For instance, we see this study recently that came out and very definitively declared that cows do not cause climate change. You know, this was the claim, of course, by the United Nations that livestock, like pigs and cows and so on, are contributing as much as 30% to global warming efforts. This is absolutely incredible. But they make that claim, and now it's been refuted. It's scientifically very good study that, in fact, the cows don't cause climate change. However, this hasn't stopped people like, for instance, the people in Denmark, for instance. They want to tax the cows, a carbon tax now on cow farts and sheep and pigs, etc. And well, this is the first time that there's been a punitive tax against flatulence of animals, stockyard animals. It's absolutely incredible. And, you know, you have Bill Gates, he answers this with the concept now. He's going to use AI to figure out a way to genetically modify beef cows to save the planet. In other words, he wants to restructure their biome and their stomachs to somehow save the planet by suppressing the cow's ability to flatulate. Okay, well, thank you, Bill Gates. But, we see other attacks on this as well. Like, for instance, Tyson Foods is scaling up an insect protein maker or plant in the United States. Well, they say this is not going to be for human consumption directly, but it's going to be used to feed animals who will then be slaughtered, etc. But the next step, of course, is insect protein for human consumption directly. So, we see on one side there's a huge protest going on in Europe. You don't see this in the newspaper, but the deal is, for instance, Polish farmers stage 600 protests in a single day against the EU crippling green policies. Well, what's this all about? You say, well, why didn't we hear this on the news over here? We didn't hear anything about it, basically. And here's another one. Headline: The fury of Europe's farmers shocks EU technocrats. That was exactly the word they used, by the way, technocrats. They are unelected, they are unaccountable, they just basically wing it. They say their science rules, yours doesn't. But nevertheless, they said, this headline said, well, yeah, the EU technocrats are having a hard time with all this protest. They can't figure out why the people are so upset of having their livelihood taken away, as well as the people getting behind them now who want the food on the table when they want it on the table. So I tell you what, this is an amazing story. However, there is a resistance mounting. This is my whole point. I'm going to show you a short video clip, and actually it's 9 minutes long, but it says it perfectly. This was a story that came out of UK chronicling everything that's going on in Europe right now. And this is huge because en masse, people are rising up against this global cabal to tell them to stick it where the sun doesn't shine. And this is a beautiful thing on one hand. However, this whole narrative, the whole story of people rising up everywhere is being censored to death on social media and the media in general. You won't see it on TV for sure, but there's a few places who have obviously been keyed into it. But I want you to listen to this video because this really tells a story, and I want you to see the resistance at this point. This is the big story that we need to focus on right now. The resistance against this war on food. Americans, unfortunately, are not part of this resistance right now, but you'll see it in Europe for sure. Let's listen to this video.
Europe's farmers are rising up, and the elites are terrified. In France, farmers recently staged a 4-day siege of Paris, blocking major roads around the French capital. In January, thousands of tractors descended on Berlin in Germany, lining the streets leading up to the Brandenburg Gate. In Brussels, farmers have gathered from all over Europe to demonstrate against the EU and pelt the European Parliament with eggs. In the Netherlands, tractors have caused the longest traffic jam in the nation's history as part of a years-long battle between farmers and the government. This farmers' revolt is now truly Europe-wide. From Portugal to Poland, from Ireland to Italy, almost every EU country has been rocked by protests. So what's driving this populist uprising? What do the farmers want? Farmers in each country have their own specific grievances, of course, but there is a common root to their anger. What connects them is the European Union's green agenda, which has been imposed on agriculture from on high. It's made farmers' lives a misery, sacrificing their livelihoods at the altar of climate alarmism. Bureaucrats, who have no idea how farmers work and live, have essentially been condemning farms, many of them run by families for generations, to oblivion, all at the stroke of the regulator's pen. And farmers are simply not putting up with it anymore. The first stirrings of revolt began in 2019 in the Netherlands with the so-called nitrogen crisis. The Dutch Supreme Court ruled that the government was failing to cut nitrogen pollution to EU-approved levels. In response, the Dutch government promised drastic measures to cut nitrogen emissions. In all but name, it declared war on its nation's farmers. Suddenly, the government had turned against one of its most important and impressive sectors. You see, the Netherlands, despite its really small size, is the second largest exporter of food in the entire world, thanks to the world-beating efficiency of its farms. And nitrogen is intrinsic to this efficiency. Fertilizers are rich in nitrogen, and farmers need fertilizers to maximize their crop yields. Nitrogen is also an inevitable byproduct of animal farming. Livestock release ammonia, a compound of nitrogen and hydrogen, through their excrement. The Netherlands has over 4 million cows, 13 million pigs, and 104 million chickens, which is a lot of manure and a lot of nitrogen. Any crackdown on nitrogen emissions was always going to hit farmers hard. Even so, the Dutch government's proposals went even further than anyone could have imagined. It said it would buy out thousands of the most polluting farms and simply shut them down. Other farms would have to cull a proportion of their animals. This would mean slaughtering around half of all the livestock in the Netherlands. In all, this represented an unthinkable act of national economic self-harm. Thus, the Farmers' Revolt was born. Huge protests erupted in 2019. After a brief hiatus during the COVID pandemic, they came roaring back in 2021 and 2022. Dutch farmers blocked roads, railways and canal bridges with tractors and hay bales. They defied government bans to bring tractors into the hay. Tens of thousands took part in the demonstrations. But the Dutch government did not back down. It kept proposing new targets, new measures and new restrictions on nitrogen. In 2022, the government's own figures revealed that around 30% of farms would have to close to meet their emissions targets. And last year, it drew up a list of the 3,000 farms that it wants to forcibly close within the next few years. All of this has been done with the approval and encouragement of the EU. And there is worse to come in the Netherlands and beyond. The absurd nitrogen rules that are threatening Dutch farms come from an EU environmental directive that dates back to the 1990s. But the EU's eco-mania has intensified massively since then. Farmers now have to contend with the drive to net zero too. According to Laurence Tubiana, Chief Executive of the European Climate Foundation and the architect of the Paris Climate Accords, net zero will require the biggest overhaul of farming since the Second World War. And yet, once again, farmers haven't been consulted on this. Targets have simply been drawn up by the technocrats and rubber-stamped by national governments, without any consideration for their impact on farmers and their ability to produce food. And the EU's emissions rules for agriculture are especially insanely stringent. The punishing green policies don't stop there either. The Farm to Fork strategy, announced in 2020, calls for 10% of farmland to be set aside for non-agricultural use. It says that at least a quarter of EU farms should become organic. It says fertiliser use must fall by 20%. Pesticide use must be cut by 50%, and all of this should be done by 2030. Each of these demands would be enough to put thousands of farms out of business on their own. When combined, they pose an existential threat to European agriculture. And if the EU's laws weren't bad enough, member states are actually gold-plating these regulations. The EU had already demanded the impossible of farmers. Now national elites in Berlin, Paris and The Hague want to go even further. This is why farmers are out on the streets across the continent. It's why they're taking matters into their own hands. It's why they feel they have no choice but to block roads with their tractors, bring life to a standstill, and douse public buildings with manure. They are determined to remind the powers that be just how essential they are to the functioning of modern life. At first, the elites tried to dismiss the protests. They resorted to their usual playbook. They called the farmers fascists, far right, and pawns of online disinformation. But this propaganda campaign has flopped. Not only have these smears failed to demoralise the farmers, they've also failed to turn the public against the protests. In country after country, European peoples are backing their farmers, even as the protests disrupt daily life. In the Netherlands, where our story began, a farmers' party briefly managed to storm electoral politics too. The Farmer Citizen Movement, or BBB, was set up in 2019 amid the nitrogen crisis demonstration. Less than 4 years later, the BBB swept the board in the Dutch provincial elections. It won the popular vote in all 12 provinces, the first time any party had achieved this in Dutch history. While the farmers' protests managed to bring tens of thousands onto the streets, the Farmers' Party managed to mobilise almost 1.5 million voters. The fury of the farmers has now become impossible to ignore. The usually tenured elites across Europe have been forced to listen and respond. In Germany, farmers have got their government to delay planned cuts in subsidies for agricultural fuel. And they've managed to keep their tax breaks on tractors and farm vehicles, which were also under threat. In France, farmers have extracted millions of euros in additional grants, and they've put paid to government plans to hike fuel taxes. In Ireland, a deranged government proposal to cull 200,000 cows has quietly been shelved. Even at the EU level, farmers have already chalked up some significant victories. Remember that plan to halve the use of pesticides by 2030? It's now been torn up. But the protests aren't going to stop anytime soon. How could they? These concessions, though welcome, do not go nearly far enough. The green agenda is diametrically opposed to the interests of agriculture. So long as European politicians are committed to net zero, then the farmers will always be in their sights. What's more, the farmers' cause will continue to resonate with ordinary people, who are also served poorly by their environmentalist leaders, whose policies are pushing up prices and obliterating food and energy security. The farmers are merely the canaries in the coal mine. They were just the first group of people to be pushed to breaking point and to get organised in response. The farmers offer a cautionary tale to Europe's rulers. The green elites assumed that farmers would just take their bitter medicine. They had no idea just how devastating their regulations would be to farmers' way of life. They failed to see the human beings behind the emissions figures on their spreadsheets. And the broader push for net zero could soon generate much more resistance from a much broader section of society. After all, under the current plans, our energy bills are set to soar as we replace fossil fuels with unreliable renewables. Our trusty gas boilers could soon be ripped out, replaced with expensive and inefficient heat pumps. Older, cheaper vehicles are being taxed or banned off the road in the push towards electric cars. Yet again, the establishment seems to think it can change our way of life and shred our living standards without a peep of discontent. This is bound to provoke an almighty backlash, and the farmers have shown us the way. So, long may the farmers' revolt continue, and here's hoping it inspires many more people to take a stand.
Isn't that the truth? This is really a sad, sad story. On one hand, I'm glad that the farmers are rising up in Europe. They should. They're not doing it here, however, but in Europe they're making a big stink. However, they've had some slight political gains like for instance, in the Netherlands, but not enough to make a difference. This green agenda is continuing even as we speak right now, and in America as well, because America has had the same policies implemented here that is being implemented in Europe in the first place. Now, when we look at what has happened here in America, this is astounding. This headline just came out recently. The big squeeze. Over 140,000 U.S. farms have been lost in the last 5 years. Can you believe that? Right under our noses, these people have just forced these farmers out of business. Now, certainly, there's always been an attrition of farmers because the kids don't want to keep the farm, whatever, the parents got to sell it, et cetera, et cetera. There's been that kind of attrition over the years. But this is way, way beyond that. These farmers are being driven out of business because of economic concerns. They can't stomach what's going on with all the regulations, whether it's things like the wolves being introduced into areas where they'll prey on cattle, or other things like the cow farts, changes necessary to because of economic regulation, just opposed for no good reason other than they want to save the world from global warming. This is the biggest scam that the world has ever seen in its history. However, Americans, I hope, will get the picture at some point. They're under attack. The war is being prosecuted against them. And this is existential for us in the future because we need food. We used to be a nation who was completely self-sufficient on food production. Now we import so much of our food from overseas, from Mexico, from South America, from Europe and elsewhere, and from Asia as well. We do not have the ability to produce enough food for our own citizens at this point. That puts us in harm's way for any type of disruption in the global supply chain, and it could really be ugly very quickly. So, there's nothing we can do about this in the short term, but I'll tell you what, we need to mount a protest in America against these regulators who are seeking to destroy our agricultural industry. And it's not just animal, obviously, it's everything. They want to destroy the whole shooting match. I wrote here in this particular article that this editor, that would be me, of course, has had an extensive background in farming and ranching, so this story is both sad and maddening. The plight of family farms have been dire for decades, but now is getting existential. The UN's Agenda 21 and 2030 agenda, coupled with the war on carbon and nitrogen-based fertilizers on one hand, on the other, the massive consolidation of the food chain into six giant global corporations. As technocrats needlessly seek new food sources like insect proteins and genetically modified species, they are indeed about to destroy the food chain altogether. This is serious business. Well, in any case, thank you for listening to this short rant, if you will, about the war on food. We need to be after this, and I just encourage all of you listening to this broadcast today, listen, take notes, spread it around everywhere that you can, and make a difference, please. Make a difference in your own community to push back.
Thanks very much, Patrick. It's very interesting that the fury of the farmers shocked the technocrats of the European Union. The technocrats had no idea that by telling families that have been on the land for many generations that they simply have to leave, that wouldn't upset some people. They didn't realize that attempting to change the economy of Holland, the economy of other countries, and the foods we eat might upset some people. What this tells you is really that our political leaders are ripe for education. They really don't necessarily have any idea what they're signing on to, and they need to hear it from us. We found last year when we worked on the WHO that the politicians we were able to speak with were very receptive when they heard what was actually happening. They only have a few moments to read a few bullet points. They hear a talk. They're told by, their party leader what they're supposed to think and do. But when they hear from thousands of their constituents, things can change.